watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on Neo-Paganism, Witchcraft on the rise. What is happening in our world today and on university campuses across the country, a growing movement of the occult. It's really sort of perplexing for some of us that grew up in the last part of the 20th century. How is it that we could be where we are today? Well, I wanted to talk to someone who's spent gobs of hours researching and writing on the subject matter, learning more and more as he has his own interest in the subject. Our guest today is Anthony Costello. He is the author of The Return of Paganism, Everything Old is New Again, published by RC Press. And we'll put a link in the description so you can buy this booklet by RC Press. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Yeah, Kurt, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. Yeah.
So this booklet, what would interest someone like you to look into folk religion, Wiccan, the occult, etc.? I mean, maybe we could start off broader, like people use this term paganism. What is paganism? What does that mean?
Yeah, no, it's good. Let me do this this way. I'll start off like what got me thinking on this topic, and then we'll go into trying to define the term a little more carefully than it tends to be thrown around. So, I mean, as you know, like we both did the apologetics program at Biola University. And, you know, at the time we were there, and this is not that long ago, the big boogeyman on the block was like scientific materialism, right? And everybody was learning analytic philosophy of religion and trying to get more and more, develop analytic arguments for just the existence of God or how we can know about God or whatever. And, and we can think of all the great Christian apologists over the last, 30 or 40 years, going back to like maybe Planting and Swinburne, who launched all of these, ships of apologetics in both the UK and the US. But all the while, we kind of maybe were ignoring something else that was going on. And, we sort of saw this every once in a while when we get some kind of Pew Research or Barna report that said, Christian belief and practice or church attendance is waning, right? It's lowering. But atheism, strictly atheistic materialism, is not necessarily growing in numbers. There's this whole other category out there that seems to be on the rise, which is often called the nuns. And when pressed, these nuns would say things like, well, they're spiritual but not religious, or something like this. And I think we tended, at least I tended to think, well, they're agnostics or probably atheist leaning, right? And we didn't take that spiritual but not religious part maybe serious enough. And then, in the last 5 or 6 years, we had this explosion of what I call social theory, or the ramifications of social theory, which started with Marx, and then it got brought over through groups like the Frankfurt School philosophers. That would be like Adorno, Marcuse, Horkheimer, Fromm, etc. That sort of exploded on the popular scene just in the last 5 or 6 years. And then everybody's sort of scrambling to deal with more, the Marxist side of the atheist coin, right? And we didn't really have a great response for social theory, or critical theory, as it's called popularly. And I was actually then starting to read a lot of critical theory. And I was reading an article. I was reading some of the Frankfurt School philosophers back in like 2015, 16 at Talbot, especially Marcuse, who was the most impactful of them all. But then I was reading some critical legal studies materials, critical race theory stuff. And I started to realize in this literature, there were certain moves to sort of deconstruct what is called Eurocentric thinking, what in popular parlance would be called whiteness. That is more than just an attack on anything racial. It's an attack on sort of fundamental ways of thinking about reality, right? And there's one article I was reading. It was published back in 1997 in the Minnesota Journal of Law by Kenneth B. Nunn. And he goes after what I could only call like cognitive features that he associates with Europeans. Okay. And they're like it's like dichotomous thinking, abstraction, objectification, like objectifying, like making objective statements about reality, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that he criticizes there, and this is found in other critical theory literatures, is the idea of desacralization. Okay, I'm like, boy, that's an interesting, like, what does he mean by that? This isn't a journal of legal studies, mind you. And what he kind of meant, and other critical theorists will mean by desacralization, not all of them, but some, especially critical race theorists, is this idea that God is transcendent or abstract or distant from the realm of concrete experience and reality. And this is a very European way of thinking or conceiving about God, right? Now, the alternative to that is that God would be very immanent and sort of involved in the day-to-day workings of the world and of human society, especially, right? And as I dug deeper and deeper into this, I started to realize that really what a lot of critical theory is an attack on what I would call the biblical worldview coupled with Platonism, which of course is the Augustinian synthesis, right? That there are eternal truths, there are realities that we can discover, and so on and so forth, and everything gets sort of immanentized, right, and pushed down into the world, right? And so this desacralization is this idea that on this Eurocentric view of God, God is separate, distinct, apart from the world, apart from creation. So as I started to think, like, well, what is the opposite of, or the alternative to that, is that God is the world.
Is the world. Yeah.
Is that God is not only in the world, but that the world itself is sacred or sacralized. Right. And there's this deep, and when you start going into there, you see this deep push in all of these sort of social justice movements and initiatives. It can be the anti-colonialism aspect of it that pushes back not just against the historical atrocities that European settlers may have actually brought to the New World, but also against the worldview that they brought to the pagan indigenous peoples, the folk, the people had their own folk religion, which all of these pre-Christian religions, they're all what we'll now define as pagan. And one of the fundamental features of any paganism is essentially what Paul talks about in Romans 1:18-32.
Yeah.
That the creator and the idea of the creator and creation collapse into each other. And that there's only one divine thing, and that is the universe itself. So it's pantheism. Another word for this that we all know doing apologetics is pantheism. All is God, nature is divine, and it's nature that sort of produces things, to include things like the gods and us.
I feel like I just got a, 50-foot or 5,000-foot look of these important ideological distinctions, and you got it all the way down to this beautiful, here's the camps, and we had to go really high, and now we're back down low, and so that is paganism. That was just a great explanation.
Right. And not everybody got to that by reading critical legal studies, journal articles in critical legal studies. But I'll tell you, more and more people now are coming to realize that the worldview shift has occurred. We thought atheists thought we could carve out this purely secular space, right, where we could just have science telling us about a physical world that was utterly impersonal, and that we could figure it out through our cause and effect sort of instrumental reasoning. But that's just not what human beings are like. Human beings are, at the end of the day, homo religiosus, right? And we think in terms of agency and not just in terms of mechanical thinking. This was even a criticism by the critical theory philosophers, the Frankfurt School, of the positivists, like the A.J. Ayers of the world,
Right.
who thought that science would just tell us everything. And then once science fully described reality, well, we just sort of had to get on with life.
Right. So on the one hand, you've got the error of the secularists because they want to just treat science as this mechanical thing, like you said, and no religiosity. And then on the other hand, you've got sort of the pagans, which now would conflate the created world with God. So there's errors on both sides, and the Judeo-Christian worldview is like, no, you each sort of have half right, but it's not the proper model there.
I think that's one way to look at it. And that's basically what the early church was in that position, because you had this, in Frederick Copleston's History of Philosophy at the end of volume 1, he points this out very, very carefully, that it almost looks like, well, I think we would say it does look like God had prepared the way for the incarnation, for the Word to become flesh, right? We talk about the fullness of time, because you had in the pagan world, you already had the advent of philosophy, starting with the pre-Socratics, culminating with Aristotle. Well, he would say, maybe Coppels would say culminating with Plotinus and Neo-Platonism. But you also had the long history of pagan myth, right? This mythical world where you have all of these very similar themes to the themes we get in the Bible, like propitiation, sacrifice, atonement, so on and so forth. The one thing you never had in any pagan myth, though, I should point out, is the idea of repentance before a holy God. That is absolutely unique to the religion of Israel, to Judaism. So you have this preparation in advance of the gospel, and the intellectually, and also this poetic, what's called this poetic world, right? The kind of world that Jordan Peterson sort of loves to talk about, the poetic theology, right? All this, type and archetype and, these different meanings that are put into that are conveyed in myth making. Yeah.
Right? And this is what leads Lewis to talk about the true myth, right? I mean, it's
the myth become fact. Yes.
Yeah. Myth become fact, right? It's the joining together of both these camps, and like holy buckets, you've got history and you have myth proper as a genre, not like fiction, which some people just conflate, but like the proper genre of myth. And here it is. Myth becomes fact. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you get to Augustine, you get that synthesis, and there's obviously the church fathers are working that out, and you get the Augustinian synthesis with Neoplatonism, later Aquinas' synthesis with Aristotle. And you feel like with the medieval synthesis, you have this very robust worldview of revelation and reason working together, right? The philosophical and the theological, sort of combined, right? And then we won't go into the full history of how that then starts to degrade over time. But we're sort of starting to come back into a similar place, I think, as where the early church fathers were. There's a disenchantment with the natural sciences. They cannot actually answer those deepest questions. So in some very real and serious, very real way, concrete way that we can see in culture, people are turning, but they're not necessarily turning back to Christianity.
Right.
Some are. We have some examples, but they're at least turning back to something like myth. Right? They're turning back to something like the poetic view of reality, replete with stories and agents that almost populate the world around.
Let me ask, is this sort of an evolution of postmodernism? Is this like postmodernism, like create your own reality, but is this like the next step because people are like, well, there's no meaning to be found there, so let me go back to the ancient myths to find meaning, or rather that they're so disenfranchised like they're still postmodern and they think, well, I'm just going to create my own myth that other people have created. Like, is that where this a little comes out of?
This is speculative. This is what I think is going on. I have to develop this out a little bit more. I think with postmodern, you're right. The idea was the artist class, right? The artist class that Plato said should never govern. It was the worst class to govern. But unfortunately, our culture is being governed in a sense by the artistic
Correct.
class.
Yep.
It is the artistic class who elects our governmental leaders, and you only need to have watched the RNC and the DNC, the conventions, to know that it's the artists.
All you have to do is hop on Twitter, and you're going to see all these videos of endorsements by celebrities. And I'm like, I don't care on either side. I don't care what celebrities think. What do they know about political philosophy?
It's like, who's going to sway more votes one way or the other? Is it going to be Hulk Hogan or is it going to be Taylor Swift?
Yeah.
Right. Is the Hulkster going to get more votes for Trump, or is Swift going to get more votes for Harris? Right. So you got something like that going on. But where was I going to go with this idea of
postmodernism and in
postmodernism? As I read through a lot of postmodern, like philosophy of postmodernism, it's more than it. You're right to say it's about trying to create new worlds through our own powers of creativity. This was sort of the goal of the postmodern, especially writer in literature. But also, it's like, how do we create new worlds that we can sort of then maybe live in? And hopefully there'll be better worlds. But these are sort of obviously mental constructs, right? And I think what my theory is that we know that this is just the product of our own minds. And really deep down, it's still Romans 1. We want to worship something. And we're skeptical enough to know that we really don't want to worship ourselves. And in a sense, we do need something outside of ourselves that we want to worship. And now there's a long history of this too. So, but we don't want to. So if you think of the 19th century German and British romantics, Goethe, Schiller, and then Coleridge, and trying to think some of the other poets, Shelley, especially Shelley in Britain. They want something. They're certainly about the creative power of man, right? To create worlds and beauty, right? And aesthetics. Now we have more just entertainment and aesthetics. But they also want to hold a place for something outside of themselves, right? That is mysterious, that is beyond just their own, and they just call this nature, you know? And I think everybody still desires to worship something because beyond themselves. I might be really proud of a book, or if I was a poet, maybe a poem, but I know that I just made it, and I'm still aware of my own humanness, right? So I think what paganism clearly offers is especially a neo-paganism, right? It offers something outside of ourselves, nature, right? That we can give ourselves over to, that we can worship, that we can adore, that we can objectify and bow down to in a certain way, and through various rituals and means. But that's also not a transcendent God with a transcendent moral law. Right? That is then something that we may be obligated to follow. So nature is numinous. It's mysterious in the same way God is mysterious in a sense. It's sort of powerful in a sense. But what nature is not, what the numinous is not, is it's not holy. Right? Nature is not righteous. Okay? And to worship nature is one way to sort of give yourselves over to something that's clearly not you, although you're a part of, and you can commune with it. But there's not a moral law necessarily in nature itself. So, and we can separate that from design. But yeah.
Is the pagan then in the same camp as the secularist in the sense that there is no grounding for morality? So they would have to say it's like socially constructed?
Yeah, so there are pagan academics. I'm not familiar with many of them. Michael York is one, and I read a lot of his work. He's a legitimate scholar, and he's trying to work out both a pagan theology and a pagan ethics. But, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, this is a very difficult thing to do. The Stoics really couldn't figure it out because as metaphysical monists, where all is divine and all is God, well, then you have this dual aspect of nature, right? So, an example, like there's beauty in nature that it inspires me to act a certain way, okay? But there's also just cruelty, nature red in tooth and claw, right? That may inspire me to act a very different kind of way, right? What Lewis points out, and I believe it's at the beginning of Mere Christianity, when he talks about dualism, he talks about, he was attracted to dualism in a sense because you have that two eternal principles, the eternal principle of light and the eternal principle of dark, or of good or evil, right or wrong, whatever. But he makes a very simple observation. How do we know to call one light and the other dark? By what measure or standard that must be transcendent to the two aspects?
Yep.
Can we even call one the dark and the other light, or one good and the other evil? Right? So when we talk about the natural law, that's why I don't want to say we talk about the natural law. When we as Christians talk about natural, we're talking about the moral law, right? That we do see that is eternal, but it's also transcendent, even though we can sort of see aspects of it in nature. That's going to be very difficult for the pagan to sort of the neo-pagan. You could, but most neo-pagans are not going to want to say that there is something sort of transcendent to the universe itself,
right,
by which we can gauge things within the universe as good or evil, right or wrong, so on and so forth. So it's still an area I'm working on. I still have to get through some of York's and others' work on this. But a lot of times what you'll get, especially in neo-pagan practice, is sort of a skirting around the moral issue. It'll be something like a consent-based ethic that is conducive for our own to our own democratic age, where we don't want to, you just presuppose that autonomy is good, and any violation of another's autonomy is what we would call immoral. Now, whether or not that's just a socially constructed thing, however,
right?
Yeah, I think you'd have to say it is, and I'd also have to say, I think consistently, you'd have to say that can change. That can change as the culture changes. And there are pagans, groups of pagans, for example, they're somewhat more prominent in places like Scandinavia, that are ethnocentric pagans, called ethno-pagans. And some of those get very dark. Some of those expressions of neo-paganism are quite dark indeed, because they're racist in the sense of they believe that their gods and their ethnic culture is superior to others.
Is this like classic, like Odin and Thor, like Norse mythology?
Yeah. So another type of neo-paganism that we're seeing emerge is one that does try to reach back in the past and recapture ancient myths and even ancient practices of ethnic people groups, right? That would not only include, it's like in Scandinavia where temples are being built. I think there's a new one that just went up in Iceland. Iceland's a hotbed for neo-pagan, ethno-paganism. And you see it in like the Norwegian death metal scene. It's very prominent. I think I mentioned in the booklet a couple episodes from the 90s with regards to that sort of how paganism and death metal music go together. But yeah, so where was I going with this on the ethno-paganism?
I was asking about the ancient religions, almost pantheon of gods.
Yeah. You see that in Central America, South America. You're seeing you see that with regards to the Aztec gods. You see it. I saw it here in L.A. County. I opened with the story of the L.A. County School District
Really?
educator
Wow.
who was trying to work in chants and incantations to named Aztec gods in K through 12 LA County schools in association with social justice initiatives,
Yeah.
invoking the names of Quetzalcoatl or Chiche in order to inspire these school children to a new consciousness of social justice, right? And that could be African paganism. It could be various types of folk religion. Now they'll be synthesized with more contemporary ideas and thoughts.
Yeah.
But there is this desire, I think, in all of us to especially if it's an identity issue, right? Social identity, that you're going to want to draw from the past. You're going to want to draw from your past ancestry, right? And what did my predecessors believe until those Christians came?
But some of them sacrificed their children on the altars of these folk gods. And one of the things that separates the Judeo-Christian ethic for a long time, right? Story of Abraham is the demarcation. It's the way of saying, hey, Yahweh is a different type of God and does not want your children to be sacrificed on altars. That was the historical demarcation. Whereas these pagan folk religions, they're still doing that. Let me ask, in your research and studies, have you found, as wild as it might seem, that there are some people willing to physically kill their children on the religious altars of these folk, or other pagan gods?
This is where I know that I have stories from people where it's getting pretty intense. People who go out boots on the ground.
Yeah.
Right. And sort of engage and try and get into pagan rituals and stuff. I would say that we should probably expect that things like that are going on. I would say this, pro-lifers have made this comparison for a while now. I think it's fair enough.
Sure.
I mean, with abortion, and we see how abortion is held onto with such religious zeal.
Yep.
Especially on the left, which of course, the left is predominantly antithetical to Judeo-Christianity and probably more open to alternative spiritualities than people on the political right. Although I'm not going to I wouldn't exculpate people on the political right from possibly being open or interested in alternative spiritualities as well. I don't know.
Correct. And
but
political parties shift over time. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if you're already embracing what we know is basically sacrifice in the womb, you're already doing the dirty deed of murdering a living child, right? Yeah. I think to add a ritualistic or religious component to that is the easier part of the two steps. So it wouldn't surprise me. Now, I know I have heard, I don't have a link or anything right now, but I'm sure it's a fairly easy Google search, that there are bills in Texas, I think of all places, by Wiccan, I think it's a Wiccan group, that is claiming that they need abortion rights based on their religious beliefs and practice.
Wow.
So I would expect to see more of that type of legal
and of course it's always a push for federalism. Like for me, I'm a big states' rights guy. And so this creates haters on both the left and the right, because on the right you have people calling for, a federal solution to some socio issue, and I think states should just handle it. But of course the call from even the Wiccans would probably be like a federal, right? We need a federal solution to protect religious freedom, which is not the way it used to be in America. It used to be a state issue back in the day.
When I was researching the Wicca issue, and that is the fastest growing identifiable group in the country, and you have to say, like, look, and this is where we also want to start thinking apologetically and pastorally. what kind of arguments, if there are any, can we use with the pagan, who is, again, a very different sort of breed than the
Scientism.
logical positivist of the 1950s and 60s. In a sense, these are all materialists, but a very different conception of what matter is and what matter can do.
Yep.
Right. But what kind of arguments might be helpful to us, but also pastoral, like how are we going to engage with these people? I mean, pagans are trying to live in this world as well. And they're dealing with all of the same kinds of issues that we deal with, just as living in the 21st century, in a weird, Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic kind of culture. I was doing some research on Wicca, and being a former army guy, I was, there was a couple stories about a guy who wanted to be a Wiccan chaplain back in the 90s. And it was sort of his personal story and struggle to become a Wiccan chaplain. And I think they do have Wiccan chaplains in the military now. I don't think there's many of them. But, yeah, so, we need to start thinking about how we can engage well with Wiccans or other pagans who maybe they've explicitly rejected Christianity. Maybe they haven't explicitly rejected Christianity either, right? Maybe they're at this point, maybe they're a second generation Neo-Pagan. I don't know. I mean, it could be, right? The 60s were a heyday for Neo-Pagan, emerging Neo-Pagan belief and practice. So we're second, maybe third generation already now for some pagans.
What would motivate someone to look into witchcraft as opposed to embracing like a folk religion of the pantheon of gods, right? Because both are forms of paganism, but what would draw someone to, say, witchcraft in particular?
Okay, so those two are not mutually exclusive. Witchcraft, or let's just say magic, right?
Yeah.
Because when we get to, so I think we already defined paganism ontologically. We said all paganisms are going to be metaphysically monistic, right? Nature, capital N, is divine. The creator and creation distinction collapses in on itself, right? When it comes to epistemology, it's all about experience. Okay. Now part of the pagan realm of ideas about the world is that the gods, like us, are a product of this undifferentiated, Kaufman uses the term meta-divine stuff. So you got an eternal universe, an eternal matrix of the material world, out of which the gods, this is the myth, the gods come out of this. The gods then make us, right? And this can be updated with evolution theory or something. But the universe is eternal on any paganism, and that's important. And there's this sort of, in the mythological, in the ancient myths, it's referred to as, is the primeval realm, or it's conveyed as a chaotic waters or a seed out of which everything else emerges. The role of the magician, magic, is to make contact with that realm, is to get access to that meta-divine realm out of which all other divinities come, to including the gods themselves. Even the gods in the ancient myths use magic, right, to access this realm. And that could be access to things like mantic knowledge, would be knowledge of the future. That's, your sort of future-telling prophet, your soothsayer.
Yep.
It could be to control aspects of nature, even our own nature. It could be to control others, right? So magic, whether, it be in the form of Wicca, which Gerald Gardner, who sort of followed in Aleister Crowley's footsteps, but he sort of systematized this idea of contemporary magic. I haven't gotten deep into that literature yet. I'm still going through a lot of this. But magic is still there to be used by the wizard or the witch. Tends to be more females involved in magic than males. just a sociological fact, which we could talk about theologically and biblically, though, is to use magic for one or two purposes. One is to access that meta-divine realm for the sake of power and control, right? And that could be power and control over healing somebody who's sick, who you love. I mean, we don't have to always think about it in these maniacal, demonic ways, although we do want to think about him in those ways as well. So witches or, people who use magic, they'll talk about light magic and dark magic. You think about in those terms. Light magic might actually be trying to heal somebody or just feel better.
All this makes me think, let me throw you like a left jab here to use a boxing.
Yeah.
Does that mean Jesus is a magician because Jesus is tapping into some powers?
No. Okay. This is good. This is an important biblical distinction. So I wrote, so I'll just finish one thought. You got the magic for the sake of accessing and then getting power and control over the natural world. The other is deification, that the magician transcends himself and sort of becomes the full master of himself and his world. It's a type of theosis. Yeah. Right? Of course, immanentized and not with reference to anything other than nature. Right? Okay, so those would be sort of like the two main reasons for magic. Now, Jesus does not tap into the meta divine, right? He is the source of, or if depending on your view of kenosis. Okay. Yeah. God is directly the source of nature and what happens with and in nature. Unlike the Jewish exorcists or wonder workers of his day, with one exception, when he takes the mud, Jesus only has to speak, right? And the miraculous occurs because it's through the power of his words that creation comes into existence and can be recreated, right? The magician has to manipulate. He has to use incantations, chants to try and tap into what we might call, from a biblical perspective, these other spiritual entities that seem to exist but that are were created by God, right? Take the Michael S. Heiser view of the Elohim, but we know this would be demonic entities that maybe have some power, agency, and a moral nature that can grant certain things to those who are willing to sort of participate with them. Okay, Jesus doesn't have to do this, being the incarnate Logos, right? The second person of the Trinity and the source of all nature. Now, this actually comes up earlier in the Bible, too. And I wrote an article on this. It's on Patheos. Why did God prevent Moses from entering into the promised land? Now, for a long time, I heard, it's because Moses got angry and that misrepresented God. And I'm like, and that answer never sat well with me. It's like, God's getting angry all the time. Moses,
you think the striking of the rock twice was like Moses' attempt at like an incantation?
Okay, so Yeskel Kaufman, who I reference, I don't know if I referenced him in the ebook, but he wrote, he had a view along with several of the rabbinical commentators from early on through the Middle Ages. And I don't know Hebrew, but there's the way Moses speaks right before he hits the rock, and Aaron's there with him, and Aaron dies in the next chapter, at least in Numbers. He dies in the next chapter. So Moses doesn't get allowed into the promised land, and Aaron dies in the next chapter after the striking of the rock in Meribah, where the waters flow out. And what Moses says there is he says something like, "You rebellious, children of Israel, shall we now draw water out of the rock for you?" And then he goes through these motions. He says that, and then he strikes the rock like a technique. And what Kaufman and others point out is, he should have said, "Shall Yahweh now draw?"
Yeah, he's including himself in the ability or the power.
Starting to shift into thinking that he's the source of the miraculous. Mm-hmm. And you got to think, why primarily? What is the main reason that God has the Israelites in the wilderness for 40 years? It's to wean them off of these false conceptions of who God is and what Yahweh is like, because they've been surrounded by the pagan Egyptians for 400 years.
Yeah.
Right? And how those gods work. So God's trying to wean them off of this. And then here goes Moses. He starts to present himself more like a magician who not only is the source of the miracle, but who can control Yahweh through certain incantations and movements. It elevates Moses and it demotes Yahweh, and it makes Yahweh look as if he's like one of these other just local deities.
Mm-hmm.
That if you sort of use magic, you can also access and force Yahweh's hand to act. This is a big problem in the contemporary church, by the way. We are doing this today, I think, in some of these churches that claim that the office of prophet and apostle have been reinstated.
Yeah.
And they have a certain view of prayer there that I'm very skeptical of. So, but we can do that another time. But so I think Jesus doesn't need to do this. He's the source of the power.
Got it.
Okay, and that's the difference there. The magician's trying to tap into the meta divine. He's not praying to the source of the meta divine, which is God.
Yeah. Interesting distinction. I know there's so much more we can get into, and yet time is running short for us. While we close up here, so two things. One, and take the first question first here. How do we as apologists then approach the Wiccan? I know you sort of mentioned this earlier, but what are your suggestions for how we as an apologetic, of course we have to love all people, so we need to reach people apologetically with our ethics of love. But what are some of the even arguments? How do we try to win them over into realizing what they're doing is wrong?
Well, that's a hard question. I don't know if I have all the tools to try and answer that right now. Somebody I would recommend maybe having on your podcast is Carl Teichrid, who's got a great book here called Game of Gods. And Carl is up in Canada, but he goes to like Burning Man every year. He goes to Pagonicon every year. He's done a lot of boots on the ground engagement with Wiccans, with pagans, Neo-Pagans, all kinds of folks. So I would certainly recommend his work. I think his website's called Forcing Change. I mean, I'm not encountering pagans on a day-to-day basis. I would say, though, we never think like it will depend certainly on the personal story of the person. I mean, did they leave Christianity? Are they unfamiliar with Christianity? Which, may be hard to think. Like, are people unfamiliar with Christianity in America in the 21st
I'm sure.
century?
Yeah, I'm sure there are now. Yeah.
But by now there might be, like I said. So with the pagan, who's open to the supernatural, who's not maybe making arguments against God so defined, right, in a pagan worldview. I don't know that our analytic arguments are going to work so well. There might be some that to employ there, especially those with regards to the cosmological arguments. But I think, and I was talking to Carl about this. It's going to be a different kind of engagement, I think, with the pagan or neo-pagan practitioner than with the diehard, scientistic materialist that is at Harvard or Cambridge somewhere.
Yeah, and maybe not so much of an intellectual discourse. That's interesting.
There'll be a greater openness there, and I think it's going to be more where we might need to go. We might need to go a little bit right into our theological articulation. Right? How does some of these deeper issues of meaning, purpose, existence, does Christianity answer those in a way that is more sufficient than can be answered within the realm of a neo-pagan view?
So, then my second question would be, when I think about scientism and, the atheistic logical positivism, we're dealing with objections from problem of evil. Doctrinally, we're dealing with divine omnipotence and divine omniscience. Would you say that for dealing with paganism, doctrinally, we might be, say, dealing with like transcendence and special revelation? Are those going to be some of the focal points in those discourses?
Yeah, so I've been trying to think about this a little bit more deeply, and I still have a long way to go on this. What doctrines then? What theological doctrines are going to become maybe more? We need to do a little more work on, right? I was thinking, like omnipresence, God's presence.
Yeah,
right?
Good. Yeah.
Because one of the things that clearly is motivating, I think, a lot of pagans is that desire to be in connection with something that, again, is not maybe not mysterious, but it is more than just me, right? It is more like, so like, and if I can have experiences of that, Neo-Pagan ritual and practice it's all experiential, right? So when you go to Burning Man, I've not been there yet, but maybe I'll go in the future, or any of these transformative events, it's all about the experience of it all, that gives you a sense of the transcendent, and how, as Christians, and how are we going to articulate how we know and how we experience God in our lives? Right.
This might open up a can of worms. But you talked about how the pagans will seek out the experience of the transcendent. Aren't there a lot of Christian churches doing that today?
Yes, there are. And okay, so now you've got like the other side of the coin, where I'm talking about, this is what I say, we have to articulate well certain theological doctrines like God's omnipresence, or prayer, or a religious experience, and pneumatology, of course. Yes. And there's problems in some of them where the experiential has to, again, always be bounded by the revelation contained in the Word of God. Right? If the experience that we all long for an experience of Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? I've had 3 in my life, and nothing, like I say, nothing compares. Nothing compares to when God, one was obviously at the moment of my conversion. The other was right before I had my quadruple bypass surgery just 2 years ago. And then 1 or 2 episodes in Afghanistan. And when you have the direct encounters with the living God, of course, that's all we want, right? There's nothing better. That's it. That's what you're made for. But that this can be, how can I say, counterfeited to some degree.
Yeah.
Is something that obviously Paul talks about, Satan disguising himself in the angel light. And we see throughout the Bible that God allows, for whatever reasons, that there can be sort of counterfeit religious experiences. And that's where we have to have the words of God as given to us in the Bible that give us the knowledge we need to discern, right? Discern the spirits. What is a veridical experience of the living God, and what is a counterfeit? So it's both. We worried about dead orthodoxy for a long time, where Christianity just becomes propositional, just about propositions and how they hang together, right? But we need those propositions. We do need them. We knew that they're referring to the realities out there, so that when we have the direct encounters and experiences, we know what is true, what is false, what is real, and what is counterfeit. So it's going to be, but I think we'll be encountering more and more people, and we are, and we see it just in popular culture, more and more people who are not coming at this from a purely scientific worldview, but that they are looking for things that only the Christian revelation claim can really answer.
Amen. And a great point to finish on. Before we sign off here, you're the president of the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics. Tell us about your work at the Kirkwood Center.
Yeah, Kirkwood Center is it's another resource for the church. Myself and some colleagues from Talbot School of Theology and Biola University started a few years ago. We have our own podcast, the Theology and Ethics Podcast. We have a YouTube channel, Kirkwood Center. We got several YouTube videos up there where we address a lot of these issues now, but all kinds of philosophical.
Yeah, some of them really narrow, like
issues.
5th century monks and their view of original sin.
There was this one guy we had on, very similar to yourself, talking about something called that has to do with Pelagius or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Semi-Pelagian. But yeah, well, we like to do theology, and yeah, we're just trying to produce good additional resources for the church because we got, with all the knowledge at our fingertips, all the information, I should say, at our fingertips.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot to navigate through. So we're trying to tackle at least the biggest issues, and then every once in a while do some deep dives into things that just maybe us theology nerds are interested in.
I can appreciate both of those things. Yeah, Veracity Hill, we're trying to clarify complex issues. There's, like you said, there's so much information, and boy, how do we navigate the sea of ideas here? It's hard for a lot of people to do. I mean, not just folks like us that are a bit more nerdy, but the average day, churchgoer.
Well, and I'll just end on that. I'll put this out there just to leave this hanging in the air. One thing we really all need to be very aware of is how neo-pagan belief and practice is being synthesized or can be synthesized with the emerging artificial intelligence, power of artificial intelligence. So those are the types of things we need to be thinking about because it's coming.
Yeah, fascinating. You mentioned that because just last week on Veracity Hill, we were talking about AI. I was giving my reflections on the pros and cons, on that emerging tech, and some yellow flags. There are a lot of caution flags, like, hey, it's a good tool, but we got to be cautious here, or else.
Yeah, we need to be very cautious, I'd say. Yeah,
Good.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Anthony. And for those that want to purchase the booklet that he has written, The Return of Paganism, you can go to press.ratiochristi.org for the RC Press shop, and you can search for his booklet there. It's about 25 to 30 pages if I'm going off the top of my head. Sort of an afternoon read. Fascinating material by Anthony Costello. I highly encourage people to go ahead and check out his booklet, available in print and also ebook forms, available right now. Well, before we sign off here, I do want to give you a heads up about what's coming down the pipeline here. Next week, we'll be talking about the historical background to Halloween as a holiday and what's up with all of that, and was it evil origins or was there something else? And the following week after that, we're having a special Election Day live stream where I will be giving a defense of the Electoral College as a robust system for the United States, and I'll be going through some clips from one of my favorite political films, Swing Vote, with Kevin Costner. Great little movie. I think it's family friendly. He's sort of this drunk, so I got to make sure there might be a swear word or two, but it's a great sort of entertaining explanation to the Electoral College as well, as it turns out. So we'll be playing some clips from that Election Day live stream in a couple weeks. Well, that does it for the show today. I'm grateful for the support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month to support our sustainable ministry efforts here at Veracity Hill. I'm also grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Apologetics 315, and Rethinking Hell. I want to thank our technical producer, Gabe, our media associate, Mark, and our guest today, Anthony Costello. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for watching in as we're striving for truth on paganism.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.